What's up?
Not much. I'm just reading about this Wednesday's National Walkout Day. I guess some schools let students leave class and others didn't.
Yeah, that's interesting. Can't imagine why a school would have ever allowed such a thing.
Yeah, the same is definitely true for me. And even if the school would have said okay, my parents would have never allowed it. The church I grew up in was pretty strict, and the town I grew up in was very small. Everyone was interested in what everyone else was doing.
So I guess walking out of school would not have been admired as an exercise of freedom of speech or an act of faith.
Not exactly. In fact, I remember, I guess it was after Trayvon Martin was killed in Florida, and the person who killed him, what was his name?
George Zimmerman, maybe?
Right. Well, the Sunday after he was acquitted, we had someone who was kind of a newcomer at church, maybe a teacher at the high school. Anyway, he stood up during Joys and Concerns, and he said something like, "Let us ask God to forgive the racism in our church and in our country."
Whoa.
Yeah, you could have heard a pin drop. And I think that may have been his last Sunday with us.
That's so sad. When you think about it, the church always seems to be on the wrong side of all the issues until they finally get it right. And from the very beginning, the church has said, you have to convert and be like us, or, you know.
Tell me about it. I got so frustrated with our church. The way the leaders manipulated people like my parents. It was so sad. Once, when I was in high school, our family thought about hosting a foreign exchange student. We were all excited, and I actually think my parents would have done it. But they weren't sure how it would go over with the church.
Really?
Yeah, I have to confess, church was rough for me. And the sermons don't even get me started.
I can see why you left. But, the thing is, I don't know. Our church was kind of like that, pretty judgmental about what was going on in the world. But it was also filled with people I really liked. And people I know who really liked me and treated me like I was special, almost like I was their own kid.
I guess we definitely had that too. There was one particular woman at my church, Ms. Ruby, we called her. She always came by herself, always sat in the same pew, and always said hi to me and smiled as she left worship a little early and I came back into the service. But never anything more than that. And then when I graduated, she gave me a card on the way out of the church. And when I opened it, there was a check for $500, and it just said, "I like your spirit."
Aww, exactly. Mine was Mr. Garver. He never gave me a check, but he always made it a point to find me, call me by name, shake my hand, and on those rare occasions I would go to church during college. Somehow, those people have really become important to me. I think of them often. And I'm not sure I'd have people like that if it weren't for my church.
Yeah, you're right. I kind of miss being important to someone that I don't even know that well.
That's one thing they don't serve at the coffee shop, right? Hey, I gotta go. See you at the march next week?
Absolutely.
And I need to take a picture of you so you can send it back to your church.
You will do.
Let's pray. Loving God, it is our prayer today that the words of my mouth and meditations of our hearts would be acceptable and pleasing to you, for you remain our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Today I want to tell you real quickly about 4 churches. Church number 1 is the Smartsburg Christian Church in Smartsburg, Indiana. Montgomery County, central Indiana to be precise, corn and soy country. Now the Smartsburg Christian Church is right in the heart of Smartsburg on Old Route 32 that cuts across the state. It's right in what's left of town anyway, which actually isn't much. Because towns like Smartsburg, Indiana were close to the interstate highway, Highway 74, that goes from Indianapolis across the Wabash River to Danville and then on to Champaign. It was close to the highway, but it wasn't on the interstate, or near enough to it to gain the rewards of all of the traffic. So not too long after those interstates were built in the 1960s, great breakthroughs as they are, those same highways spelled the death for towns like Smartsburg. The antique shop and the church at the center of town, they're beautiful buildings, but they weren't attractive or friendly enough to lure people off the beaten track. Any of you all know of Smartsburg, a town that is kind of shriveled up. Anyway, Smartsburg has come upon some hard times, but the little disciple church, beautiful church, still is there. Not quite enough people coming to church in Smartsburg to hire a full-time pastor, so you know who they use to provide leadership at the Smartsburg Christian Church? They used to use student ministers from Christian Theological Seminary about 60 miles away, learning their trade. Smartsburg is one of a dozen, maybe even more, congregations in central Indiana where part-time pastoral leadership is provided by a seminary student. Classes were all on Tuesday night through Friday morning at Christian Theological Seminary so that students could get in their cars on Friday afternoon and magically turn from student to pastor. Drive to their congregations where there may be a parsonage and a family, or maybe not, and then be a minister until Monday. Preach on Sunday, call on Monday, back to seminary on Tuesday. That's how a lot of churches did it back in central Indiana, and it's a great arrangement for the most part. Pastors learn the trade, congregations got ministers. There was really only one problem that kept coming up at churches like Smartsburg Church. Because typically seminarians who are new to the task of preaching, they're most often also on fire for the gospel, for their interpretation of the gospel that they recently learned in class. An interpretation that was all about changing the world and bringing new insights, revolution sometimes, to the pulpit, all of which are very good things. But having said that, typically the good folks at Smartsburg Christian Church and others like it were in existence and still around because they had banded around a particular way of doing things that most often involved a patriarch or a matriarch whose beliefs carried the day. And so in a place like Smartsburg, the ministers come and go every few years, but the people and the matriarchs, they stay. So it wasn't unusual at Smartsburg Christian Church for the ministers on fire for the gospel and a little rough around the edges to get a little frustrated when the people in the pews didn't get as excited about their ideas as they should. Their agenda for liberation theology and social change. This isn't to say that the good people at Smartsburg didn't care about the world around them. It is to say that the setup, that the student minister hadn't been there for long enough to become part of the community in order to be able to speak with authority about these important issues, which usually meant gaining the trust of the matriarch or the patriarch. Many, in fact, most seminarians would come away from a year-long ministry in places like Smartsburg that ended badly, saying some version of this: they just don't want to do anything. They don't want to do anything. They don't care about the issues of the day. And there was some truth to that, to be sure. On the other hand, Smartsburg finally decided not to be a student church anymore and called our friend Joyce to be their part-time minister, who stayed there for 6, 7, maybe even 8 years. And she found those people full of care and compassion for the world around them because she had time to become part of the community, to speak with authority. I believe that congregations that are the most passionate about addressing issues of injustice around the world are the ones where true communities of trust have been formed. Sometimes, certainly not always, but sometimes, congregations that couldn't give a whit about social justice issues are the same ones that can be lured into reaching out in the name of Jesus, because trust has been born in those congregations. True enough that churches like Smartsburg have a reputation for being clumsy at best and mean-spirited at worst when it comes to addressing those issues. But I believe that if true community and trust can be built, sometimes those little congregations can surprise the world. Congregation number 2. Bethany Christian Church, circa 1970 or 71. A congregation that sits about 5 miles south of the Washington Beltway in Prince George's County. Our home congregation when I was about 13, I think, in 1970. The congregation back then was pastored by a man who had 2 things going for him. He had a retirement from the Air Force as a career chaplain, and he had anger issues. It was politically conservative, so there was no participation in this congregation in the events that were happening right around the corner in Washington, D.C. in that time. But his politics really didn't matter. He could have been politically liberal, and the congregation still would have been in this malaise, because he ruled his flock with an iron crook. He did not like being crossed, and people weren't about to risk being hurt and reach out beyond their comfort zone. But, behold, in that same congregation there arose a small group of sort of disaffected people that were able to offer a little community to one another inside the larger community. That group formed something of a loyal opposition in that larger community. After feeling written off by their pastor, they didn't get mad and run away, they got mad and stayed. Of course, they made the senior pastor furious, and that was hard on everybody. But out of that group of folks who learned to care for one another and forgive one another and be community for one another, arose a people with passion for social justice and change, a willingness to pass that passion along. I believe that care for others, care for the wounded in the world, arises out of knowing what it feels like to be cared for in a community of love. Church number 3. We don't know who the pastor was. We don't know too much about where the church might have been, but we do know that it existed toward the end of the 1st century. We also know that it was trying to come to terms with this crazy thing, the increasing likelihood that the world was not going to end for them in a cloud of glory. The increasing likelihood that the glorified Christ was not going to return from them and take them to a land of no pain or sorrow. So among other things, this congregation was hanging on every word when Matthew wrote, to try to figure out how to learn how to live in the world. When they received the scroll written by Matthew, they needed to know those things about being a regular old church, because they were going to be around for a while. So in a way, Matthew tells them what to do to be church in his gospel. And we heard Lisa read today part of that instruction. How do we handle disputes? Matthew gives us an answer. A pretty good one, actually. Matthew tells them how to handle disputes. He says, first of all, try to work it out yourselves, just the 2 of you. If that doesn't work, bring in a couple of more. That's good conflict management material. If that doesn't work, take it to the board. And if that doesn't work, don't ever speak to them again. Yeah, it may not be part of the good part of that strategy. But then Matthew utters words of pure gold in the mouth of Peter. Words that have worked so often for so many. Words that have helped people learn how to offer love to others, to people who are hurting. How often do I forgive? Is it 6 or 7 times, God? I'm trying to remember. Well, Jesus says, no, that's not quite right. He says, you don't count forgiveness. You offer it as often as it takes. 77 times was just like saying forever. When it comes to forgiveness, we don't keep score. People of God, hear the good news. Communities saturated in forgiveness are the engine that drives care for the marginalized. Once we know how it feels to be loved when we don't deserve it, we learn an eagerness to offer that love to others who are sometimes judged unlovable. Which brings me to Congregation for Christian Temple, March 18th, 2018. What kind of community are we? How can we use Matthew's words to be better? In what ways can we disprove the notion that the church is always on the wrong side of the issues of the day? We have a story to write, Christian Temple does. We've been writing it for a while, but we have a new story to write for the world, and the first chapter always needs to be about forgiveness. Offering and receiving forgiveness. Then, out of the power generated by that forgiveness, each of us is called to march, called to cook, called to size clothing, called to tutor, called to write letters, called to build homes. Each of us is called to transform our own gratitude for forgiveness into a passion for justice, so that we can change people's minds about the church, one act of mercy at a time.